Who could possibly be knocking on Christmas Eve? Snowflakes floated gently down, blanketing the quiet streets of Willow Creek and settling on rooftops and walkways like a soft winter quilt. Inside homes glowing with warm light, families gathered close to celebrate Christmas Eve, the sound of laughter mixing with festive music in the air. But at the edge of town, one house stood apart, silent and unlit. Grace Thompson tugged her coat tighter around her as she passed the old Victorian mansion at the far end of Maple Street. There was no wreath on the door, no lights twinkling in the windows, just a hollow stillness that hung in the air. She slowed her pace as she reached the front steps. On the porch sat an elderly man, slouched in a creaky rocking chair, his gaze vacant. His silver hair was neatly combed, his coat properly fastened, but the emptiness in his eyes said more than words ever could. Grace recognized him instantly. Mr. Edmund Clark. He'd once been a towering figure in town, a wealthy business tycoon known by nearly everyone. But after losing both his wife and son, he had disappeared from public life, withdrawing into the shadows. Now, here he was. Alone. On Christmas Eve. Grace swallowed hard. She understood what hardship looked like. At 32, her work as a social worker had shown her far too many people left behind and forgotten. But not tonight. Without a second thought, she turned and headed down the street toward the tiny all-night diner. 10 minutes later, she came back, hands full with a hot meal, a steaming cup of cocoa, and a small gift wrapped in cheerful paper. She climbed the steps to the porch and knocked. Silence answered. Then, slowly, footsteps shuffled toward the door. The door groaned as it opened. Edmund stood there, sharp eyes dulled by years of grief and weariness. His voice came out flat, almost guarded. "If you're selling something, I'm not interested." Grace offered him a warm smile and lifted the bag in her hands. "I'm not selling anything, Mr. Clark," she said gently. "I just thought," she hesitated, "no one should have to spend Christmas alone." His eyes flicked between her face and the food she held. One hand gripped the doorframe, his fingers tightening. "And what do you want in return?" "Nothing," she said softly. A beat passed in silence. Then, with a quiet breath, Edmund stepped back and gestured toward the inside. "Well, come in before you freeze out there." Grace stepped through the doorway. The grand entrance hall stretched out in front of her, once beautiful, still elegant, but cold now. Like a place frozen in memory. No tree, no garland, not a single hint of Christmas cheer. They made their way into the sitting room, where the fireplace let off a soft, flickering glow. Edmund lowered himself into an old armchair. Grace set the food down gently. "It's not fancy," she said, "but it's warm." Edmund studied her for a long moment before lifting the cup of cocoa and taking a sip. "No one's brought me Christmas dinner in a very long time." Grace's smile was small, but heartfelt. "Well, I'd say it's long overdue." For the first time in years, Edmund Clark shared a meal with someone on Christmas Eve. At first, he was mostly quiet. But as the room warmed, something inside him did too. He began to talk, about his wife, his son, the life he'd had and the people he'd lost. Grace listened, not out of sympathy, but from a place of genuine understanding. When the last bite of food had been eaten, Grace reached into her coat and handed him the tiny wrapped box. Edmund looked at it, brow furrowed. "What's this?" Grace shrugged. "Just a little something. Nothing big." He held it for a moment, then set it carefully beside him. As midnight crept closer, Grace rose to her feet. "Thank you for letting me stay," she said sincerely. "I know this probably isn't how you pictured your evening." Edmund let out a breath, almost like a laugh but heavier. Neither was Christmas. Her heart squeezed at his words. Still, at least he hadn't spent the night alone. He looked at her again, and for a brief second, something shifted in his expression, maybe gratitude, maybe something closer to hope. Grace gave him a small nod and stepped toward the front door. Miss Thompson. She paused and turned. His voice was softer this time. Thank you. She smiled back at him. Merry Christmas, Mr. Clark. And with that, she stepped into the cold winter night, completely unaware that everything in her life was about to shift. 1 hour later, a knock on her own front door would turn her world upside down. Grace walked slowly through the quiet streets on her way home, the air cold and sharp against her face. Snow had started falling again, dusting the town in a fresh layer of white that sparkled under the streetlights. Yet despite the chill, she felt something unfamiliar, warmth. She hadn't expected anything from tonight. She hadn't even planned to stop at Edmund Clark's house. But something deep inside her had said, go. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Grace had caught something different in his eyes, a faint spark breaking through the shadows he'd been living in for so long. She couldn't help but smile as she reached her little apartment, brushing the snow off her coat before stepping inside. Maybe it didn't mean anything. Maybe Edmund would wake up tomorrow and retreat right back into his old, quiet world as if none of tonight ever happened. But for this one night, he hadn't been alone. Grace dropped her purse on the entry table, kicked off her boots, and was just about to put the kettle on for tea when a sudden knock echoed through her apartment. She paused, frowning. It was after midnight. Who would be knocking at this hour? For a second, she debated ignoring it. But curiosity, and a strange sense of concern, nudged her forward. She stepped cautiously toward the door. Peering through the peephole, she felt her stomach knot. 2 men in dark suits stood outside, lawyers, from the looks of them. She opened the door a crack, just enough to see their faces clearly. The older man, dressed neatly in a tailored navy coat, offered her a polite smile. In one hand, he held a thick envelope that looked far too official for comfort. Miss Thompson, he asked. Grace's heart skipped. Yes. My name is Robert Sinclair. I represent Mr. Edmund Clark. He's requested to see you, immediately. Grace blinked, caught off guard. Edmund? Robert nodded calmly. Yes. He said it was urgent. Her pulse quickened. Is he all right? He's fine, Robert replied. But he made it very clear we come straight to you. Grace glanced at the 2 men, her mind racing. Just hours ago, Edmund had barely opened his door to her. Why on earth would he suddenly want to see her again, especially in the middle of the night? She hesitated, but something in Robert's voice told her this wasn't something to ignore. Let me grab my coat. Minutes later, she was seated in the back of a sleek black sedan, watching the snow-covered streets pass by in a blur. Her thoughts spun the entire drive, trying to piece together what this could possibly be about. By the time they reached Edmund's estate, Grace's hands were freezing, despite the warm air pumping through the car vents. The mansion looked exactly as it had earlier that night, dark, quiet, looming like a memory against the wintry sky. Robert led her up the steps and knocked once. Almost instantly, the heavy wooden door creaked open. Edmund stood in the doorway, more awake and alert than she'd seen him just a few hours ago. His tired eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, he simply looked at her, studied her. Then he stepped back. Come in. Grace gave Robert a quick glance before stepping into the house. The warmth inside was immediate, wrapping around her as she moved through the front hall. The sitting room looked just as she'd left it, except this time, the fireplace was ablaze, casting a golden glow across the room's grand but faded features. Edmund lowered himself into his armchair and gestured for her to sit opposite him. She did, trying to quiet her racing heart. Mr. Clark, what's this all about? Edmund let out a long breath, rubbing his hands together as if collecting his thoughts. He looked like he was searching for the right words, and for a moment, Grace wondered if he was going to back out of whatever this was. Then he finally spoke. I've had a hard time trusting people, Miss Thompson, he began, his voice lower than before. After I lost my wife and son, I learned the harsh truth: people will take advantage of you. The ones I thought were friends. They disappeared as soon as the grief came. All they ever cared about was what I could give them. Grace gave a quiet nod, not entirely sure where he was going, but sensing it mattered deeply. Edmund's eyes stayed fixed on her. But tonight, you didn't knock on my door because you knew who I was. You didn't bring food or stay out of pity. You came simply because it felt like the right thing to do. Grace felt her chest tighten. He raised a hand gently, signaling her to let him finish. Please. Just listen. At that, Robert stepped forward and placed the thick envelope on the table between them. Grace glanced down at it, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. Edmund took a slow breath. I don't have much time left. Grace's stomach sank like a stone. The doctors won't come right out and say it, Edmund said plainly, but I can feel it, I know. And I've had a long time to get everything in order. Except for one thing, deciding who it should all go to. The breath caught in Grace's chest, as though the air had been pulled straight from her lungs. I don't have any family left. No one to inherit anything. Over the years, my lawyers have drafted version after version of my will, he said, motioning to the envelope, but I could never bring myself to sign one of them. He looked at her steadily. Not until tonight. Grace shook her head in disbelief. I'm sorry, I don't get it. I don't understand. A faint smile touched Edmund's lips. I've decided to leave it all to you. For a moment, the room froze. Grace's breath hitched. What? You heard me, he said softly. Her thoughts spiraled in every direction. No, this can't be real, she stammered. There's got to be some mistake, I mean, I barely even know you. Edmund let out a quiet chuckle. Exactly. And yet, out of everyone I've crossed paths with, you're the only one who showed up for me, without any reason to. Grace felt like the ground beneath her had shifted. This is crazy. I can't accept something like this. Before she could say more, Robert cleared his throat. Miss Thompson, Mr. Clark's estate is valued at more than $70 million. Grace's mouth went dry. Edmund leaned forward slightly, his voice softer, more thoughtful. I'm not asking you to take it and vanish into some luxurious new life. That's not what this is about. I know you, Grace. You're someone who gives, even when you don't have much to give. And I believe you'd use this to do good. That's why I chose you. Her hands trembled in her lap. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say much, Edmund replied gently. Just promise me you'll think about it. Grace let out a shaky breath. Everything inside her wanted to scream no, this was too much, too fast, too unreal. But deep down, in that quiet place where instincts live, she knew. The moment she'd knocked on Edmund Clark's door, something had shifted. Her life had already started changing, and it would never be the same again. Grace sat rigidly in the oversized leather chair in Edmund's sitting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The fire crackled nearby, blazing in the hearth, but the heat never seemed to reach her fingertips. Across from her, Edmund rested in his chair, the thick envelope still lying between them on the gleaming wood table. The weight of everything unsaid pressed heavy on her chest. He watched her carefully for a long moment before finally speaking. What did you do tonight, Grace? His voice was steady, calm, even gentle, but the question caught her off guard. Grace frowned slightly, confused. I brought you some food, she said, her voice quieter than she'd meant it to be. And a small gift. Nothing special. She trailed off, took a breath, then added, I just didn't want you to be alone on Christmas. Edmund's eyes never left hers. And why did you feel that way? Grace blinked, unsure of how to answer beyond what she felt. Because, it was the right thing to do. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the gentle crackle of the fire. Then, at last, something shifted. Edmund's lips curved into the faintest smile, a subtle change, but it was the first real emotion she had seen cross his face that wasn't burdened by grief or guarded by walls. "Do you know how many people have come to this house in the last 10 years?" he asked quietly. Grace shook her head. "None." Her breath caught in her throat. He turned his gaze toward the fire, his expression distant. "When my wife died, I stopped letting people in. After I lost my son, I stopped believing in them altogether. And eventually, the world stopped trying." He looked back at her then, and his eyes held a quiet truth. "Until tonight." Grace felt her chest tighten. "I've had wealth beyond what most people could ever dream of," he continued, "but I've also spent years watching it lose all meaning." He tapped his fingers gently against the table, slow and rhythmic. "Most people only see the money. They look at me and see a number, not a person. They smile. They're polite. They pretend to care. But in the end, they all want the same thing." Grace's brow furrowed ever so slightly. "And what exactly is it that they want?" Edmund's eyes locked onto hers without flinching. "They always want something in return." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. "But you," he leaned in, resting both hands on the table as his tone softened, "you didn't come to my door expecting anything. You didn't show up because of who I was. You came because you saw someone sitting alone on Christmas, and you knew that wasn't how it should be." Something shifted inside Grace, an odd mix of discomfort and something deeper. Something that stirred beneath the surface, hard to name but impossible to ignore. Without a word, Edmund reached for the envelope and slid it across the table toward her. "Which is why I'm giving you this." Grace paused, eyes on the envelope. Slowly, she reached for it. The weight of the thick paper in her hands felt almost symbolic. Carefully, she opened it and pulled out a stack of neatly arranged documents. Her heart jumped when she saw the first page. Her name was there, printed in bold, unmistakable letters. Grace Thompson. She flipped to the next page. Then another. Her pulse quickened. These weren't just any papers. They were part of a will. A breath caught sharply in her throat. "Mr. Clark, this can't be real." Edmund's lips curved slightly in a knowing smirk. "Oh, it's real. Very real." Grace instinctively slid the papers back toward him. "No. I can't accept this." Edmund chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "It's already done, girl. You don't get to back out. I've made my decision." Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. "This is too much. I mean, we barely even know each other." Edmund tilted his head slightly, eyes calm. "Maybe. But you're the only one who's ever actually seen me." Grace tightened her jaw. "I don't want your money, Edmund. That's not why I came." He didn't flinch. "I know that," he said gently but firmly. She swallowed against the emotion tightening her throat. "I'm not saying you have to take it and disappear into some comfortable life of luxury," he continued, watching her closely. "That's not what this is about. I know who you are, Grace. You give, even when it costs you. And that's exactly the kind of person I want to carry this forward." Still overwhelmed, Grace shook her head again. Her thoughts raced too fast to catch. I don't even know what I'd do with all of it. I'm not trained for this. I'm not qualified." Edmund didn't rush her. He simply studied her with the same calm, grounded presence. Then he exhaled, voice low. "Let me ask you something." She looked up, meeting his gaze again. "If you had the chance, the resources, to do more than just scrape by. If you could really change lives, would you take it?" Grace's breath caught. Edmund continued without waiting for her to answer. "I spent a lifetime building something. But now I want to hand it off, to someone who won't waste it. Someone who'll actually do what I never had the courage to." Her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the envelope. Edmund leaned back slightly, giving her space to think. Well, if this money wasn't meant for you, but for the people who need it most, what would you do with it? Grace's thoughts spun in all directions. For years, she'd done everything she could with barely anything. She'd seen families lose their homes. Watched the elderly try to survive on next to nothing. Held the hands of children who had never known stability. If she had the tools to truly make a difference. She let out a deep breath, steadying herself. I'd help. Edmund's smirk returned. Then there's nothing left to debate. But Grace wasn't done. Edmund, this still feels like too much. Does it? His voice was gentle now. You've spent your entire life giving, Grace. Always putting others ahead of yourself. But no matter how much heart you have, you can only do so much when you're working with nothing. He nodded toward the envelope again. This changes everything. Grace stared down at the stack of documents, her fingers slightly trembling as they traced over her name printed in bold across the page. Edmund's voice came softer now, almost reverent. This isn't about the money, Grace. It's about what the money can do. Every part of her wanted to reject it, her mind screaming that it was too much, too surreal, too impossible. But somewhere deeper, quieter, a small voice whispered. Maybe this was supposed to happen. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a breath, and when she opened them again, she met Edmund's gaze. This was never really about me, was it? Edmund gave her a real smile this time. No, he said simply. It never was. Grace exhaled slowly, feeling the gravity of the moment settle over her like a warm but weighty blanket. The night she'd knocked on his door had felt like a small gesture, just an act of kindness on Christmas Eve. But that single act had unraveled something much bigger. Now, she stood at the edge of something life-altering. She sat motionless, taking it all in. Edmund's words circled through her thoughts. He didn't want her to take his fortune, he wanted her to use it. When she'd arrived at his door, she hadn't expected anything, just hoped to offer a little comfort to someone who seemed forgotten. But now, she was being asked to carry out a vision larger than she could have ever imagined. Her thoughts ran wild. Edmund. I don't even know how to begin something like this. He leaned back in his chair, studying her quietly. Do you think I knew what I was doing when I started out? Grace hesitated, then shook her head slightly. But this is your legacy. You built all of this. I'm just someone who cares. Edmund lifted an eyebrow and interrupted gently. And in my experience, Grace, someone who truly cares is rarer than wealth, brilliance, or power. She let out a breath that trembled with uncertainty. You're asking me to be responsible for more money than I've ever seen, more than I ever dreamed of handling. He gave a calm nod. I am. And I wouldn't be if I didn't believe you could do it. The responsibility pressed down on her like a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. Her eyes scanned the room, the elegant but aged furniture, the grand fireplace casting flickers of light against tall bookshelves. All of it a testament to a long and accomplished life. And yet, despite all that he had built, Edmund had been living in silence, in solitude. She turned to him, her voice quieter now. Can I ask you something? He nodded. If I hadn't come to your door tonight, what would have happened? Edmund's expression tightened, his lips drawing into a thin, unreadable line. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Grace already knew. He rubbed his hands together, then looked at her with weary eyes. I've been waiting, Grace. For a sign. Something, someone, to prove that maybe, just maybe, there are still people who see past what I have. Who see me. She looked down again at the documents, her name staring back at her like a challenge. All right, she whispered, drawing in a deep breath. I'll do it. Edmund didn't react right away. But, she added quickly, there's one condition. He raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. You're not doing this alone. Grace held his gaze. That's right. You're coming with me. For the first time that night, he looked genuinely caught off guard. Grace, I'm an old man, he said with a small shake of his head. I don't think. She cut him off. No. You don't get to sit here alone anymore. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it together. The silence that followed stretched, but not uncomfortably. Then, to her surprise, Edmund laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that filled the space between them. You're a stubborn one, aren't you? Grace grinned. So I've been told. He smirked, shaking his head in surrender. All right then, Grace. You've got yourself a deal. The months that followed turned their world upside down, in the best way. The once quiet halls of Edmund's mansion were suddenly filled with energy, movement, and purpose. No longer a place of stillness and memory, the house became a hub of plans, ideas, and action. Grace poured herself into the work, researching how to stretch Edmund's wealth to do the most good. She dove into grant programs, community outreach, partnerships, and infrastructure. Logistics, legal steps, community needs, she studied it all. And Edmund? For the first time in years, he had something to wake up for. He wasn't just writing checks, he was building something lasting, something that mattered. He met with local leaders, reconnected with former business partners, and began using his resources to create something that would last long after either of them were gone. Together, he and Grace brought the Christmas Kindness Foundation to life. Its mission was clear and powerful in its simplicity. No one should feel forgotten. No one should face life alone. At first, not everyone was convinced. Edmund Clark, the man who hadn't been seen outside his mansion in years, now suddenly showing up at food banks, community centers, and shelters. Whispers filled the town. Some were curious. Others, skeptical. A few even assumed there had to be a catch. But then something happened. The foundation started making a difference, real, visible change. It started small. Modest grants for struggling families helped make sure no one went hungry through the holidays. Then they launched housing support for seniors who had slipped through the cracks, those quietly living in isolation, barely getting by. Grace and Edmund visited shelters together. Not just to donate supplies, but to sit. To listen. To ask questions and hear answers. To see people. Really see them. And when people spoke, the foundation responded, with real, tangible help. As the months passed, word spread. And something that had once seemed impossible began to take root. People started to believe. This was happening. And at the center of it all was the man no one expected, Edmund Clark. The one who had once turned away from the world, now fully a part of it again. 1 year later, Christmas Eve came around once more. But this time, the Clark estate didn't sit in silence. It glowed. Strings of twinkling lights draped across the front lawn. Long banquet tables filled the yard, covered with steaming food, hot cocoa, and beautifully wrapped presents. Downtown, the town square had been transformed into a snowy dreamscape. The Christmas Kindness Celebration, the Foundation's largest event to date, was alive with joy. Hundreds had come. Seniors, families without homes, individuals who simply needed to feel like they belonged somewhere. All of them welcomed. Volunteers moved from table to table, serving hot meals with wide smiles. Children tore into wrapping paper with laughter. Strangers sat side by side, sharing stories like old friends. And there in the middle of it all stood Edmund Clark, the man who had once eaten alone every Christmas, now surrounded by a community that had wrapped its arms around him. At his side stood Grace, quietly taking it all in. Well, she said, giving him a gentle nudge, we actually did it. Edmund chuckled, shaking his head with a warm smile. No, Grace. You did it. She returned his smile with a soft shake of her head. No, we did. He exhaled slowly, his eyes sweeping over the sea of faces, laughter, and light. You know, he murmured, there was a time I believed my wealth was the greatest thing I had. Grace looked up at him. And now? His voice dropped to something quieter. More grounded. Now I understand, the greatest gift is having something worth giving. A lump rose in Grace's throat, and she reached out, gently squeezing his hand. Merry Christmas, Edmund. He smiled, a real, unguarded smile full of peace. Merry Christmas, Grace. And as the snow began to fall once again, Edmund Clark, the man who had once disappeared into the shadows of his past, finally stepped into the present. Alive, connected, and seen. The town square sparkled with golden lights, twinkling from every lamppost and strung across the rooftops of old brick buildings. Snowflakes drifted from the sky, settling softly over the crowd that had gathered below. The scent of cinnamon, roasted chestnuts, and pine trees filled the air, blending perfectly with the distant hum of carolers and the warm sound of laughter. Grace stood near the center of it all, quietly watching. Just a year ago, she had walked up to Edmund Clark's porch with nothing but a warm meal and a heart full of hope, never expecting anything in return. And now? Now she stood at the center of something far bigger than herself. The Christmas Kindness Foundation's first official holiday celebration was in full swing. Tables stretched across the square, overflowing with food, cocoa, and cookies. Volunteers moved briskly, handing out hot meals to families and individuals who needed them. By a towering Christmas tree, children sat on blankets, opening gifts, each one donated by people who, not so long ago, had been strangers, but were now part of a growing community. Everywhere Grace looked, she saw the ripple effect of a single evening, a moment, really, that had changed everything. One choice. One knock on a door. And there, right in the heart of it all, stood Edmund Clark. He didn't look like the man she'd met a year ago. The once isolated millionaire whose mansion had sat cold and dark on Christmas Eve was now surrounded by life, by people. She watched as he leaned down to speak with an elderly woman in a wheelchair, his face soft with kindness. A man stopped him mid-conversation to shake his hand and gave him a grateful pat on the shoulder. He wasn't invisible anymore. For the first time in what must have been decades, he belonged. Grace began making her way toward him, but Edmund turned before she even got there, as if he could feel her presence. A slow, amused smile spread across his face. Well, if it isn't the woman who refuses to let me retire in peace, he said, clearly teasing. Grace laughed. Oh, don't pretend you're not enjoying every second of it. He raised an eyebrow, grinning. Maybe. But let's not go spreading that around, I've still got a reputation to maintain. Grace shook her head playfully. Too late, Edmund. The secret's out. Everyone here already knows. Edmund took another look around the square, the warm glow of the lights, the music, the people talking and laughing, coming together like family. His smirk softened into something far more honest. They really do, don't they? He murmured. Before Grace could answer, a little girl appeared at Edmund's side. She looked no older than 6, holding a small bundle of brown paper close to her chest. Her wide eyes looked up at him with admiration and just a hint of nervousness. Mr. Clark? Edmund crouched carefully, his voice surprisingly gentle. Yes, sweetheart. She held out the tiny package with both hands. This is for you. My mommy said you help a lot of people, and I wanted to say thank you. For a second, Edmund didn't move. Grace watched him as he slowly reached for the gift, his fingers trembling slightly as he unwrapped it with care. Inside was a handmade Christmas ornament, shaped like a heart, painted red, a little uneven, clearly done by small hands. Edmund blinked, his thumb brushing over it like it might break. The girl's face lit up. It's for your tree. Edmund cleared his throat. I don't have a tree. She gasped. What? Not even a tiny one? Edmund hesitated. Before he could speak, Grace jumped in. He does now, she said with a smile. I picked one up for his house this morning. You didn't think I'd let him get away with another Christmas without one, did you? Edmund let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You really are relentless. Grace crossed her arms with a grin. Absolutely. The little girl giggled, then surprised them both by throwing her arms around Edmund in a quick hug before darting back to her mother. He watched her go, his expression unreadable. Grace nudged him lightly with her elbow. You all right? He let out a long breath, still staring at the ornament. I honestly never thought I'd receive another Christmas gift in my life. Grace smiled at him, voice warm. Well, you better get used to it. He held the small red heart a moment longer, then gently slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat and gave it a light pat, like he was tucking something precious away. I think I will, he murmured. Just then, the band struck up a cheerful tune, and Grace looked out across the crowd, her voice quiet with awe. Can you believe this? Look at everything we've built. Edmund followed her gaze. Laughter rang through the square. Neighbors gathered like old friends. Elderly couples cozied up near fire pits, chatting with volunteers. Families, some who had never met, sat sharing warm meals. Teenagers helped carry grocery bags to an older gentleman's car, walking him all the way to the curb to make sure he didn't go home alone. A year ago, Edmund's world had been steeped in silence. Tonight, it was overflowing with life and warmth. Grace turned to Edmund, a familiar spark in her eye. You know, she said, giving him another playful nudge, this is just the beginning. Edmund let out a soft laugh. You're really not going to let me slow down, are you? Grace grinned. Not for a second. He shook his head with a quiet smile, not annoyed, but deeply grateful. Then he looked at her, his tone more reflective now. For a long time, I believed that my wealth was the most important thing I had. Grace tilted her head, studying him. And now? His smile was smaller this time, but it was real, rooted in something deeper. Now I know, he said, the most valuable gift isn't money. It's having purpose. Grace swallowed against the emotion rising in her throat. She reached out and rested a gentle hand on his shoulder. Merry Christmas, Edmund. Edmund placed his hand over hers, the warmth between them saying more than words could. Merry Christmas, Grace. And as snowflakes continued to fall around them, as music and laughter danced through the air, Edmund Clark, the man who had once lived in silence and solitude, finally understood what it meant to be home. In a world that moves at lightning speed, it's easy to miss the small, quiet moments that carry the most weight. Grace's story reminds us that kindness doesn't have to be extravagant to be life-changing. It just needs to be genuine. She didn't knock on Edmund's door expecting anything in return. She saw someone who was alone, on Christmas of all nights, and she chose to do something about it. How often do we walk past someone who's struggling? An elderly neighbor watching the world go by through their window. A veteran sitting quietly on a park bench. A widow spending another holiday without anyone to share it with. It's easy to think someone else will step in. But what if we are the ones meant to? You never truly know how a single, small act of kindness might change someone's life, or even your own. Sometimes it's as simple as a warm meal. A real conversation. A moment that says, I see you. You matter. Because the greatest gift we can offer each other, especially in times like these, is connection. So here's a gentle challenge this holiday season. Reach out to someone who might be alone. It doesn't need to be grand. Just enough to remind them they're not forgotten. Because often, it's the smallest gestures that spark the most unexpected miracles. If this story touched your heart, tap that like button and hit subscribe. Here at Uncovered Tales, we share powerful, real-life stories that remind us of the goodness that still exists in this world, of generosity, compassion, and the beauty of human connection. Because in the end, the smallest gifts often leave the biggest impact. Subscribe today, and be part of something truly meaningful.